And then, of course, our relationship, right? That's the other area that we want to make sure we're using efficiency in. And primarily here, we're talking about two things when it comes to relationship. We're going to be talking about trust, and we're going to be talking about hierarchy or dominance. Dominance, just like punishment, is another one of these things where it's kind of like a boogeyman in dog training. This is my boogeyman guy, right? Because dominance is this, again, this taboo topic. We're not supposed to talk about it. We're supposed to pretend it doesn't exist. But the reality is dominance exists. It exists in virtually all social animals, including human beings. And a lot of the reasons it exists for dogs are the same reasons it exists for humans. A lot of the things that make it work well for dogs are the same things that make it work well for humans. And dominance isn't a bad thing. Dominance is a beautiful thing. It's a healthy thing. It helps to avoid bigger conflicts within social groupings. Right? We have dominant structures at our churches, at our schools, at our offices, in our families. I mean, all of these social groupings, even among friends, there's often subtle hierarchies, right? And so dominance is not something that we want to ignore, but we do want to use it the right way. And again, I think historically, the issue with dominance has not been that dominance itself is bad, right? It's that it's been completely misunderstood and then misused, right? So there's a lot of training, material from, the 80s, even some of the 90s, talking about dominance, pinning dogs down, rolling them on their backs, and this. Not that like maybe that never would work, or there's never a place for that, but I think in most cases that's not really. That's a pretty poor use of dominance, because if things have gotten that far, you've probably missed something a lot earlier. And the reality is with animals, most of our dominance rituals are really quite subtle. And you wouldn't really notice them unless you knew what you were looking for. So because it's a little bit of a taboo subject, before I jump into some of these sort of areas of efficiency, I do want to talk a little bit deeper about dominance and its role. And then we're going to uncover some myths as well. So the role of dominance. Why is dominance important when we're dealing with reactive dogs? Well, why are dogs reactive, right? Dogs are reactive because they perceive a threat generally. Now, there are some dogs that are reactive just because they're like insanely frustrated. They never learn to tolerate being restrained on a leash. And so anytime something excites them, they just lose their mind, right? It's this over arousal issue because they don't have what's called frustration tolerance. Okay. And the techniques that we're going to talk about in this presentation will work for those dogs as well. They'll work very well for those dogs. But the reality is the majority of dogs that are reactive are feeling in those moments very uncertain. They see the dog coming, they see the person coming, and they see it as a potential threat. And when there is somebody in the role of higher ranking, right, whether you want to call it alpha or whatever you want to call it, that proper hierarchy is ultimately going to leave dogs feeling protected, because that's one of the primary roles of the most dominant member or members of a pack, is to protect the rest of the pack. In fact, that's the evolutionary reason why a lot of the dominance rituals that occur, whether it's wolves, horses, cattle, right, you're going to see physical battles, and they're not battles like to the blood or to the death, but there is some, even if it's just play, some physicality involved to figure out who is strongest, who is going to be the best fighter, essentially, who's in the best position to protect the rest of us. And if we haven't made clear to our dogs that we have a good hierarchy in place, that they aren't the one who's responsible for keeping everybody safe, then they are much more likely to become reactive when they perceive a threat out there. If we've made very clear that we're in control, we're in charge, we're good leaders, and we've done that ahead of time, we're in a way better position for our dogs to feel safe and protected out in the world, even if something makes them feel a little bit uncertain or makes them feel potentially threatened, right? So hierarchy really matters when it comes to our dog's emotional well-being when they're out in new situations. The other issue of dominance is, and this is, I put a question mark here because there's very limited research into this topic, but it has to do with the hormonal effect of dominance. Now, this is not unique to wolves. In fact, a lot of other mammal species as well, but in some wolves, not all, some species of wolves, it's well known in almost all species, it's well known that only the alpha male and female mate, right? In fact, I mean, most packs are primarily mom, dad, and offspring anyway, but they do at times accept outsiders into the pack, and depending on the species and the climate and the area, et cetera. But in some species, and this extends beyond wolves into other mammals as well, subordinate females do not even have a reproductive cycle. They don't go into heat. And there's a lot of debate on why this happens. But one of the prevailing theories is that the sort of social stress and social pressure that's put on the subordinates by the alpha female actually has such a strong hormonal effect that it blunts their reproductive cycle. And I don't have data for this, but we're going to talk about some techniques that we use that I believe the result of those techniques can be accounted for by this idea of the hormonal effect of dominance. And hormones are something that we really want to be thinking about quite a bit when we're dealing with behavior problems, because the Greek root word of hormone is hormon, and it literally translates into that which sets into motion. In other words, hormones drive behavior. There's really no two ways around this. Your hormones affect your emotions affect your behavior. At the end of the day, hormones are huge driving forces in our behavior. And we're not just talking about sex hormones here, but we're talking about other neurotransmitters such as dopamine that are also hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, right? All of these different things that have a very strong effect on behavior and a very strong effect specifically on arousal, excitement. And that's going to be a topic that we're going to be talking quite a bit about. Another big thing here is that corrections can't be separated from social context. This is huge. And this is one of those things that's like one of the major issues with some of the research into the use of punishment is it's extracted from relationship, right? Like if we're going to do science, we want to have a lot of controls. And so it's, they'll do things with electrical shocks and such, where it's really just an animal in a box or an animal in a room and seeing how they react to these things. And there's no social context to it. But social context is massive. If I'm walking down the street and I'm working with a dog on a leash and some random person pulls up next to me and starts telling me that I'm doing it wrong, I'm probably just going to get more aggravated or more annoyed by that than anything else. But if one of, my mentors or close friends or colleagues, happens to be in town and I didn't know, and they're the ones that pull up next to me and say, hey, man, like, I think your timing was a bit off there. Right, especially if it's one of my mentors, right, then I'm going to take that correction much, much differently. It's going to have a completely different impact on my emotions, again, on my hormones, right? So we want to be really aware of the social context of our corrections. And there's a little bit of research into this idea. So a group led by a guy whose last name is Solomon back in 1968 did a study where the goal was really just to test the effect of punishment based on timing. So what they did was they had two groups of dogs. They actually had three groups. We're going to talk about the two sort of extremes for this purpose. And what they did was they bring them into a room and they had a bowl of meat and a bowl of kibble. And there was an experimenter in the room, and the experimenter had like a rolled up newspaper or magazine, because this is the 60s and that's how they rolled back then. And so what they did was, they kind of set the dogs loose, one at a time. And most dogs, of course, would go right up to the bowl of meat because they could smell it. And in the first group, they were punished with the newspaper. They were swatted essentially as soon as they touched the food, just wham, right away. And in the second group, they were punished 15 seconds after they initially touched the food. So usually at this point, they had begun eating. And they did this over and over again every day. And this was the only food the dogs had access to. So if they learned to avoid the meat, they could get the kibble, right? The kibble they were allowed to eat freely. And they did this over and over again until each of the dogs was able to refrain from eating the meat for 20 days. And once they got to that point, they did what they called temptation tests. And in these temptation tests, they brought the dogs in the room. There's the bowl of meat, the bowl of food, but the experimenter is no longer there. And again, this is the only food they have access to. And what they're looking for is essentially like how long it takes them to break what they call the taboo, essentially break the idea of not touching the meat. And so there's a couple observations that came in. So they observed the number of days until they began eating the meat. But the other thing was they observed their behavior. And this is where things get quite interesting. So both groups acquired the taboo, and it took a little bit, there were some differences in how long it took to acquire the taboo. So in other words, for them to learn to stop eating the meat, but that's not really the interesting stuff here. The dogs who were corrected right away, so the dogs in what we call the no delay group, they refrained from eating the meat for like a huge portion. I think they did like a 30-day temptation test. And I think most of those dogs for the entire 30 days, like did not touch the meat. And the 15-second delay group went back to the meat after 2 days on average. Now, this isn't too surprising, right? Because the 15-second delay group, they were allowed to eat some of that meat. So they had some reinforcement for attempting to eat the meat. And the punishment of them being swatted was probably a little bit offset by that reinforcement. So the idea that they would, break the training a little bit sooner, that makes sense from just a purely like behavioral conditioning standpoint. But where things get weird is when we start to look at their behavior. Now, during the training, when the experimenter was still there, the no delay group showed some initial hesitance toward the dry dog food after they got corrected for trying to eat the meat. But once they started eating the dry dog food, like they were fine, they were happy, they figured out, okay, don't eat meat, all's good, I can eat the dry food. And all signs of fear were gone, right? So once they kind of figured out not to touch the food, which went pretty quick, all signs of fear gone. The 15-second delay group, however, the entire time the experimenter was present, most of these dogs were doing things like crawling on their bellies, crawling behind the experimenter, hugging the walls, urinating, defecating, a lot of really, really strong submissive signs, right? Which, again, they had this really big subjective experience, this really big emotional impact from that correction. Now, if we think about, again, emotions driving behavior, then we would kind of think that if they had a bigger amount of fear, and if they were more afraid by all of this, then shouldn't they, stay away from the food longer? But that's not at all what happened. So not only did these dogs have much more fear, much more fallout from the exact same punishment, but the training didn't even really work that good. Then during the testing, the dogs in the 15-second delay group continued to show fear, even when the experimenter wasn't there. Even when they broke the taboo and were eating the meat, they were doing it with a lot of signs of fear. Whereas in the group that were corrected right away, the no delay group, once they were a little hesitant to eat the meat, but once they tried it, they were fine. Happy, tail wagging. They were like, okay, boss is gone, I can eat. Right. And the behavioral sort of, Skinner Pavlov explanation doesn't really do a great job of accounting for this. Right. It accounts for, again, the sort of inhibition of the punishment, but not with this like massively increased fear. And then if the fear is increased so much, why wasn't there as much of a learning effect? Luckily, there is an ethological explanation for this. And Adam McCloskey, in his book, Dog Behavior, Evolution, and Cognition, talks about this study. And this is what he says about it. He says, at least in wolves, food already in the mouth is respected by others and is not taken away. The abnormal stress-related behaviors displayed by the dogs in the 15-second delay group and their frequent signaling of submission indicated that these events, punishment after eating, did not correspond with the behavioral rules of dominance. For them, the behavior of the experimenter made no sense. Thus, apart from becoming generally fearful in the presence of the human, they did not learn that the food, quote, belongs to the human. And as soon as he was no longer present in the tests, the dogs grabbed the opportunity and ate the meat, right? So again, we really, really cannot separate the idea of correcting our dogs from the relationship that we have with our dogs. If your dog sees you as a subordinate member of the family, and then you try to punish your dog, you're likely to get a very different reaction than if your dog sees you as a more dominant member of the family. And more so, if the way that we introduce punishment into our training doesn't make sense for the dog, you're going to get massive fallout. But if it falls in line with what the dogs sort of instinctually know to be true, then we can get away with using corrections or punishment without all of this emotional fallout from the dogs. And this is a extremely, extremely important concept. Okay, so let's talk about some myths of punishment and debunking those myths. Okay, so first of all, in general, dogs are not reactive because they are dominant. Okay, this is not generally what's going on. So the idea, that you're out with a trainer and the trainer says, "Oh, your dog is doing this. He's very dominant. You need to put him into place." That's not generally what's going on. Dominant dogs don't tend to walk around screaming at the top of their lungs. Okay, a dominant, confident dog, I should say, right? They're not that worried about a dog walking across the street 30 paces away. That's not going to be a general concern for a dominant, confident dog. A dominant, insecure dog could be a different story. But again, it's not the dominance driving the behavior, it's the insecurity at that point. Now, in my experience, it's very rare that I see dogs who are really actively trying to climb the social ladder with humans. Again, if you're dealing with a trainer and they're constantly telling you that your dog is trying to dominate you, your dog is trying to dominate the household, it may be true. I mean, those dogs are out there, but they're really rare. Like it's just really not that common. Most dogs, again, they recognize that they're in a world that's very strange and very artificial. There's a lot of stuff they don't understand, and they are very happy to not have that responsibility on their shoulders because being in the top position is a massive responsibility. In fact, most hierarchy issues, again, this is my experience, are much more about the humans behaving submissively than it is about dogs trying to dominate. So if you as the human routinely do things that your dog interprets as you acting in a subordinate manner, then a lot of times once you're in a predicament where your dog feels threatened by something, again, they feel they have no choice but to take that role of protector because they certainly don't have confidence that you're going to do it, again, because you routinely behave in a subordinate or submissive way. Okay, and I see a couple of people raising hands. Just want to remind you, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A section because I'm not going to be doing any questions until the end of the presentation. Okay, so it's really not generally that there's like this absolute, like the problem is that your dog is dominant and you are submissive. More often than not, it's just that there's a ton of confusion within the structure, right? So the dog's not being 100% dominant. It's just that the dog doesn't know who's in charge, right? It's just very, very confusing for them. And that confusion adds to their stress. So focusing, especially if you're a professional trainer, when we think about that 80-20 Pareto principle, focusing on the human's submissive type behavior and getting them to not behave in subordinate ways is a lot more efficient than, quote, trying to knock the dog down a peg, right? Because usually the dog is not really interested in trying to climb that ladder anyway.